Black girl hands judge a note. She instantly locks the entire courthouse. When a terrified black girl slips a trembling note to the judge during a routine trial, the entire courtroom freezes. The judge's hands shake as she reads the haunting words. "You told my mother to trust the system. Now she's dead. Will you help me? Or will you let me die too?" Within moments, the courthouse locks down, chaos erupts, and dark secrets from the judge's past come flooding back. The girl isn't just pleading for justice, she's running from a deadly truth that could destroy everyone in the room. What's the real story behind the note? And will the judge risk everything to save her? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 7A stood like silent sentinels, their polished surface reflecting the streams of midday sunlight that poured through the tall windows. Inside, Judge Eleanor Hayes sat perfectly straight in her high-backed leather chair, her black robes crisp and immaculate. Her steely gaze moved between her notepad and the proceedings before her, her expression carved from stone. The witness box creaked as Bernard Fields shifted his weight again, his navy suit wrinkled from hours of nervous fidgeting. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. His fingers drummed an irregular rhythm on the wooden railing. "And could you please confirm the dates of these transactions?" Prosecutor Jana Lee's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. Her tailored burgundy blazer added the only splash of color to the otherwise muted scene. The witness, a junior accountant from Bernard's firm, droned on about spreadsheets and financial records. Judge Hayes tapped her pen methodically against her legal pad, each soft click marking another moment in this unremarkable day. Her calendar was precisely organized. This trial would conclude by 4, leaving time to review documents for tomorrow's cases before heading home. Bailiff John Calloway stood at attention near the judge's bench, his presence more ceremonial than necessary in such a routine proceeding. At a desk to the side, Court Clerk Sarah Kim sorted through files with practiced efficiency, the whisper of paper against paper barely audible. The few spectators scattered across the wooden benches stifled yawns. One elderly man had dozed off entirely, his chin tucked against his chest. The press seats remained empty. No reporter would waste column inches on a minor fraud case like this one. "Objection, Your Honor, speculation," defense attorney Leonard Price called out, though his tone lacked conviction. He seemed to be going through the motions, much like everyone else in the room. "Sustained," Judge Hayes responded automatically, her voice clear and controlled. No hint of emotion colored her words. She had mastered this neutral tone over years on the bench, wearing her detachment like armor. As the afternoon wore on, Leonard Price rose for his closing statement. His navy tie was slightly askew as he addressed the court, his arguments well-worn and predictable. Judge Hayes listened with practiced attention, though her mind was already reviewing her upcoming schedule. Next week's docket included 2 property disputes and a contract violation, all equally orderly, equally controlled. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the intricate wooden panels of the walls. The American flag hung motionless beside the state flag, both standing guard over proceedings that moved like clockwork. Judge Hayes glanced at the ornate clock mounted on the wall, right on schedule. Her courtroom ran with the precision of a finely tuned machine. No surprises, no disorder, no messy emotions to cloud judgment. Just the clean lines of law and procedure, exactly as she preferred it. Her expression remained impassive, a mask of judicial authority that had become second nature over the years. As Leonard Price concluded his statement, Judge Hayes straightened her already perfect posture, her face set in its characteristic stern expression. She was the very picture of unwavering justice, controlled, detached, and absolutely immovable. After a few minutes, Judge Eleanor Hayes returned to her courtroom, her black robe swishing softly against the polished floor. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows through the tall windows and highlighting the rich, dark wood paneling behind her bench. The portraits of former judges seemed to watch over the proceedings, their stern faces a reminder of the courthouse's long history of maintaining order and justice. Eleanor settled into her chair, automatically adjusting her posture to maintain her characteristic rigid bearing. Her mind drifted briefly to her schedule. She had a lunch meeting with the Bar Association committee at 1:30. The thought pleased her. Everything was proceeding according to plan, as always. Sarah Kim approached the bench with quiet efficiency, her sensible shoes making no sound on the carpeted steps. She carried a neat stack of papers, routine motions that needed the judge's signature. Leaning in close, she whispered, "Your Honor, for tomorrow we have the Martinez property dispute at 9, followed by the Thompson bankruptcy hearing at 11. Both files are prepared and on your desk." Eleanor nodded almost imperceptibly, taking the offered pen and signing each document with practiced precision. Her signature flowed across the pages in perfect cursive, each motion as controlled as the last. The familiar routine brought her satisfaction, every paper in its place, every case proceeding on schedule. In the gallery, the soft scrape of a ladder against the floor drew a few glances. Philip Martin, the courthouse maintenance worker, carefully positioned himself beneath one of the overhead lights. His movements were deliberate and quiet, mindful of the ongoing proceedings. The metallic click of the old bulb being removed barely registered in the hushed courtroom. Bernard Fields remained at the defense table, his shoulders tense as he watched another witness take the stand. His attorney, Leonard Price, shuffled through his notes without much enthusiasm. Prosecutor Jana Lee sat straight-backed at her table, her burgundy blazer still crisp despite the hours that had passed. The witness, another accountant from Fields' firm, raised her right hand to be sworn in. The familiar words of the oath echoed softly through the room. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Eleanor glanced at the ornate clock on the wall, its brass hands moving steadily forward. The morning was progressing exactly as planned. She made a note on her legal pad, her handwriting as precise as ever. The courtroom hummed with quiet efficiency, papers being sorted, chairs occasionally creaking, the soft murmur of whispered conversations between attorneys and their clients. Philip Martin finished replacing the light bulb, carefully folding his ladder and carrying it toward the door. Sarah Kim returned to her desk, organizing files with practiced movements. The new witness began her testimony, her voice joining the gentle symphony of ordinary courthouse sounds. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. No surprises, no disruptions, no deviations from the carefully maintained order that Judge Eleanor Hayes had cultivated in her courtroom over the years. She allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction at the clockwork precision of it all. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor when the heavy oak door at the back creaked open, barely making a sound. A small figure slipped through the gap, a young black girl no more than 5 years old, her clothes wrinkled and her hair slightly unkempt. Her large brown eyes darted around the room, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The girl, Amara, clutched a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. Her worn sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor as she moved hesitantly down the center aisle. The few spectators present barely glanced her way, too absorbed in the mundane fraud proceedings or their phones to notice such a tiny presence. Her heart hammered in her chest as she took each step forward. The courtroom seemed enormous to her young eyes. The high ceiling, the imposing wooden panels, the stern-faced portraits that seemed to watch her every move. She gripped the note tighter, her palms growing sweaty. Bailiff John Calloway stood near the front of the courtroom, his attention initially focused on the current witness. When movement caught his eye, he turned and spotted Amara. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he registered the presence of a child in this restricted space. He stepped forward, reaching out one hand. "Hey there, sweetheart," he whispered firmly. "You can't be in here." But Amara had already anticipated his move. With the quick reflexes of youth, she darted around him, weaving between the tables where the attorneys sat. Jana Lee's mouth fell open in surprise, while Leonard Price half rose from his chair, papers slipping from his fingers. Time seemed to slow down as the adults in the room finally registered what was happening. Sarah Kim froze with a file halfway to her desk. Bernard Fields forgot his nervousness for a moment, watching the scene unfold with bewilderment. The witness stopped mid-sentence, her testimony forgotten. Amara reached the judge's bench, her small frame barely visible above the wooden structure. She stretched up on her tiptoes, her arm extending as far as it could reach. With trembling fingers, she placed the folded note on the edge of Judge Hayes' desk. Eleanor Hayes looked down at the child, her usual mask of stern indifference faltering slightly. The girl's eyes met hers, deep, haunting eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. The courtroom fell completely silent, the kind of heavy silence that seemed to press against eardrums. With perfectly manicured fingers, Eleanor picked up the note. The crisp sound of paper unfolding seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Her eyes moved across the words, and for the first time in years, her carefully maintained composure began to crack. "You told my mother to trust the system, now she's dead. Will you help me or will you let me die too?" Eleanor Hayes' eyes widened, the shock evident on her face as the weight of those words sank in. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she held the note. The stern judge who never showed emotion, who prided herself on maintaining perfect control, found herself staring into the eyes of a child who had shattered her carefully ordered world with just a few written words. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Eleanor Hayes' hands trembled as she slowly rose from her chair, her knees weak beneath her black robes. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stared at the young girl before her. Those eyes, she knew those eyes. They were Evelyn's eyes. Memories crashed over her like a tidal wave. 3 years ago, a desperate woman had stood in this very courtroom, clutching a thick folder of documents. Evelyn Morris, a financial analyst who discovered something terrible within Victor Kane's corporate empire. Eleanor remembered dismissing her case with clinical detachment, citing insufficient evidence in her ruling. The look of despair on Evelyn's face that day had been haunting, but Eleanor had pushed it aside, telling herself she was simply following the letter of the law. Now here stood Evelyn's daughter, small and vulnerable, yet somehow braver than any adult in the room. The weight of Eleanor's past decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Your Honor?" Bailiff John Calloway's voice cut through her thoughts. He moved toward Amara, his large hand extended to guide her away. "Should I remove the child?" "Stop." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again, her tone firmer this time. "Everyone remain exactly where they are." The note in her hand felt like it was burning her fingers. "Will you let me die too?" The words echoed in her mind, setting off alarm bells she couldn't ignore. Something was terribly wrong, and she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Eleanor straightened her spine, years of judicial authority taking over. "This court is now under immediate lockdown." Her voice rang out clear and strong, though her hands still shook. "No one enters or leaves this building until further notice." The reaction was instant. Jana Lee jumped to her feet, her professional composure slipping. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I have another case across town in an hour." "Objection!" Leonard Price called out reflexively, then seemed to realize this wasn't a normal court proceeding. He fell silent, looking confused. Bernard Fields sat at the defendant's table, forgotten by everyone, his mouth hanging open. Sarah Kim dropped her stack of files onto her desk with a loud thud, papers scattering across the floor. "Your Honor," Calloway spoke again, his voice low and concerned. "Should I alert security?" Eleanor nodded sharply. "Full lockdown protocols. Now." She watched as Calloway moved to the phone on the wall, speaking in urgent whispers. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut with an ominous thud. The sound of multiple locks engaging echoed through the space. Outside, they could hear the muffled sounds of security guards rushing through the halls, more doors slamming in the distance. Eleanor looked down at Amara again, seeing not just a scared child, but the daughter of a woman she had failed. Her carefully maintained judicial mask, the one she'd worn like armor for so many years, began to crack. Her fingers tightened around the note, crinkling the paper. For the first time in her career, Judge Eleanor Hayes felt real fear in her courtroom, and she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't fail this child the way she had failed her mother. Pandemonium erupted in the courtroom. People jumped to their feet, their voices rising in a cacophony of protests and questions. Sarah Kim stood at her desk, raising her hands in a futile attempt to restore order. "Everyone, please remain calm," she called out, but her voice was lost in the chaos. In the corner, Philip Martin clutched his maintenance tools to his chest, his face pale with fear. He kept glancing at the locked doors as if they might suddenly burst open. "This is completely unauthorized," Leonard Price shouted, his previously lackadaisical demeanor replaced by barely contained panic. He strode toward the bench, his finger pointing accusingly at Eleanor Hayes. "You have no authority to detain us here. This is false imprisonment." Jana Lee pulled out her cell phone, her manicured nails frantically tapping the screen. "No signal," she muttered, her professional composure cracking. "How is there no signal?" Eleanor Hayes stood tall behind her bench, her stern gaze sweeping across the chaotic scene before her. The years of maintaining strict order in her courtroom had prepared her for this moment. She brought down her gavel with 3 sharp cracks that echoed through the room. "Silence!" Her voice cut through the noise like a knife. The room fell quiet, though tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. "Bailiff Calloway, clear the gallery. Move everyone to the side of the courtroom." Calloway nodded, his broad shoulders straightening as he took control. "Everyone in the gallery, please move to the left side of the courtroom in an orderly fashion." His commanding presence helped maintain a semblance of order as people shuffled to the side, murmuring anxiously among themselves. Bernard Fields, the forgotten defendant, remained frozen in his chair, his fraud trial now seeming insignificant compared to the unfolding drama. Sarah Kim began gathering her scattered papers with trembling hands, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in the increasingly abnormal situation. Eleanor Hayes stepped down from the bench, her black robes swishing softly as she approached Amara. The young girl sat quietly in the first row, her small hands folded in her lap, seeming somehow calmer than all the adults around her. Eleanor knelt beside her, keeping her voice low and gentle. "Amara," she said softly, the name feeling heavy with the weight of past mistakes. "Can you tell me what happened?" Amara's eyes, so much like her mother's, met Eleanor's gaze. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of terrible truth. "They took my mother for telling the truth. Now they're after me." Eleanor felt her stomach clench. The girl's words confirmed her worst fears about Evelyn's death. She studied Amara's face, seeing both fear and determination in those young eyes. The guilt that had been gnawing at Eleanor's conscience since reading the note grew stronger, but alongside it rose something else, a fierce determination to protect this child, to make right what she had once gotten so terribly wrong. As the chaos continued around them, Eleanor Hayes looked at Amara, truly seeing her, not just as a disruption to her orderly courtroom, but as a child in desperate need of protection, the daughter of a woman she had failed to help. The weight of her past decision pressed down on her shoulders, but this time, she wouldn't turn away. This time, she would listen. The small conference room felt like a sanctuary of quiet compared to the chaos they'd left behind in the courtroom. Wood-paneled walls and a simple conference table created an intimate space where truth could finally emerge. Eleanor Hayes stood near the window, her judicial robe a stark contrast against the morning light streaming in. "John, no one comes in without my explicit permission," Eleanor instructed Bailiff Calloway, who nodded firmly before closing the door behind him. Sarah Kim sat next to Amara, her usual efficient demeanor softened by concern for the young girl. She'd brought a paper cup of water, which Amara held but didn't drink, her small hands still trembling slightly. Eleanor Hayes pulled a chair closer to Amara, deliberately removing the physical barrier of the conference table between them. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but urgent. "Amara, I need you to tell me everything. Who wants to hurt you?" Amara's eyes darted to the door before returning to Eleanor's face. "Victor Kane," she whispered, the name falling like a stone in the quiet room. "He's the one who—" Her voice caught. "The one who had my mom killed." The name hit Eleanor Hayes like a physical blow. Victor Kane, one of the city's most prominent businessmen, a regular fixture in charity galas and newspaper headlines. More importantly, the same man Evelyn had tried to expose 3 years ago. "What did your mother discover about him?" Eleanor asked, though the sick feeling in her stomach told her she already knew. "Mom found out he was hurting people," Amara said, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "She said he was taking people who needed help, immigrants, homeless people, and making them disappear. She tried to tell you, but—" Tears welled in Amara's eyes. Eleanor Hayes felt the weight of memory crushing down on her. She could see Evelyn clearly in her mind, standing in this very courthouse, clutching a manila envelope, begging for someone to listen. "Your Honor, please," Evelyn had pleaded. "People are dying." But Eleanor Hayes, bound by procedure and precedent, had dismissed her claims without proper documentation. "I remember," Eleanor Hayes said softly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Your mother came to me, and I didn't listen." Sarah Kim cleared her throat, her practical nature offering a path forward. "Your Honor, those files Evelyn tried to submit, they should still be here somewhere. The courthouse keeps records of all attempted submissions, even rejected ones." Eleanor Hayes straightened, feeling a spark of hope. "The archive's in the basement," she said. "Everything gets stored there, even preliminary evidence that never made it to trial." "Those files might prove what Evelyn was trying to tell us," Sarah Kim added, already reaching for her courthouse key ring. Eleanor Hayes turned back to Amara, seeing Evelyn's determination reflected in her daughter's eyes. She knelt down, meeting the girl at eye level. "Amara, I made a terrible mistake when your mother came to me for help. I was so focused on following proper procedure that I forgot my true purpose as a judge, to protect people and serve justice." Tears threatened to break through Eleanor's professional facade, but she held them back. "I failed your mother once," she said, her voice firm with renewed purpose. "I will not fail you." The promise hung in the air between them, a solemn vow that seemed to lift some of the fear from Amara's young shoulders. In that moment, Eleanor Hayes felt her carefully constructed world of rules and order giving way to something more important, the chance to right a terrible wrong and protect an innocent child from the fate that had claimed her mother. Detective Maria Torres strode down the courthouse hallway, her practical shoes clicking against the polished floor. The sudden lockdown had caught her off guard during what should have been a routine visit to file paperwork. She watched security personnel rushing past, their faces tense. "John," she called out to Bailiff Calloway, who stood guard outside a conference room. "What's going on here? Why are we locked down?" John Calloway shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes darted to the conference room door before returning to Torres. "Detective, He lowered his voice. "There's a young girl. She came into Judge Hayes' courtroom. From what I understand, her life might be in danger." Inside the conference room, Eleanor Hayes stood by the window, holding Amara's crumpled note. The morning light cast long shadows across her face as she turned to Sarah Kim. "Take her to my corner office," she instructed quietly. "The one with the solid door. Stay with her." As Sarah gently guided Amara toward the door, Eleanor Hayes caught a final glimpse of the girl's face. It brought back a flood of memories. Evelyn standing in her courtroom, desperate and afraid, clutching documents that might have saved her life. Eleanor Hayes' fingers tightened around the note. The door opened again moments later, and Detective Maria Torres entered, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. John Calloway closed the door behind her, resuming his post outside. "Detective Torres," Eleanor Hayes said, recognizing the woman's reputation for integrity. "I need your help." "Judge Hayes?" Torres nodded respectfully. "Calloway mentioned a child?" "Yes." Eleanor Hayes took a deep breath. "That girl is Amara Martinez. 3 years ago, her mother Evelyn came to my courtroom with evidence of human trafficking. The perpetrator was Victor Kane." Torres's expression hardened at the name. "The businessman? The one who's always in the society pages?" "The same." Eleanor Hayes' voice carried the weight of regret. I dismissed her case for lack of proper documentation. Weeks later, Evelyn was found dead. Now her daughter has come to me, running from the same people who killed her mother. And you believe Kane was behind it all? Torres asked, her investigator's mind already working. I do. And somewhere in this building are the files Evelyn tried to submit, evidence that might prove everything. Eleanor Hayes met Torres' gaze. Will you help me find them? Detective Torres didn't hesitate. Of course. The courthouse archives? Yes, we need to go there now before… Eleanor Hayes left the sentence unfinished, but both women understood the urgency. Then let's not waste any time, Torres said firmly, her hand instinctively checking her service weapon. Lead the way, Your Honor. The basement archives stretched before Eleanor Hayes and Detective Torres like a shadowy maze. Fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow across rows of metal filing cabinets. The musty smell of old paper filled the air, and their footsteps echoed against the concrete floor. We need to be careful, Torres whispered, her trained eyes scanning the dimly lit corners. If Kane has people inside the courthouse, this is where they'd try to stop us. Eleanor Hayes nodded, her judicial robe swishing softly as they moved deeper into the archives. The weight of past decisions pressed down on her like the low ceiling above. Evelyn's files should be in the criminal complaints section, she murmured. Meanwhile, upstairs in the main courtroom, tension crackled through the air. Leonard Price paced near the defense table, his expensive suit wrinkled from stress. This is completely illegal, he hissed to Jana Lee. A judge can't just lock down an entire courthouse. Jana Lee crossed her arms, her prosecutor's badge catching the light. Given the circumstances… What circumstances? Price interrupted. We don't even know what's happening. Across the room, Philip Martin, still in his maintenance uniform, placed a gentle hand on a young intern's shoulder. The girl's breathing came in short gasps. Easy now, he said softly. Just take deep breaths, everything's going to be fine. Carmen Doyle stood by the courtroom windows, her phone held high as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones. This is Carmen Doyle, reporting live from inside the courthouse. We're currently under complete lockdown. No one is being allowed in or out. Sources suggest this may be related to a security threat. Her live stream captured the growing unrest as people huddled in small groups, checking their phones and whispering theories about the unprecedented situation. Deep below, Eleanor Hayes pulled open a drawer labeled with Evelyn's case number. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted out a thin manila folder. Detective Torres stood close, providing light with her phone. Look at this, Eleanor Hayes breathed, spreading documents across a dusty table. Handwritten notes filled the margins of property records, lists of dates and locations connected to Kane's businesses, financial discrepancies highlighted in yellow. She was tracking everything. Torres leaned in, her experienced eye catching details. These aren't just random notes. She was mapping out trafficking routes through Kane's properties, building a case piece by piece. Eleanor Hayes' throat tightened as she remembered dismissing Evelyn's pleas. If I had just listened… A sudden sound made both women freeze. Footsteps echoed from somewhere in the maze of shelves, slow, deliberate steps growing closer. Torres immediately reached for her weapon, while Eleanor Hayes gathered the documents with shaking hands. The footsteps stopped. In the heavy silence that followed, dust motes danced in the beam of Torres's phone light. Someone else was down here with them, hidden between the rows of filing cabinets, watching and waiting. Eleanor Hayes and Detective Torres crouched behind a row of metal filing cabinets, their hearts pounding in the dusty darkness. The beam of an unknown person's flashlight swept across the concrete floor, casting long shadows through the archive room. Torres pressed her back against the cold metal, one hand resting on her holstered weapon. The footsteps drew closer, each step echoing in the silent basement. Eleanor Hayes clutched Evelyn's documents to her chest, trying to control her breathing. Decades of maintaining a stern judicial demeanor hadn't prepared her for this kind of raw fear. The light beam paused near their hiding spot. Torres raised a finger to her lips, though the gesture wasn't needed. Both women remained perfectly still as seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, after what felt like hours, The footsteps began to move away, growing fainter until they faded completely. "We need to copy these quickly," Torres whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the documents, page by page. Eleanor Hayes held each sheet steady, her hands trembling slightly as she remembered Evelyn's desperate face years ago. "Done," Torres nodded. Eleanor Hayes carefully folded the copies and slipped them into her robe pocket, the paper crinkling against the thick fabric. Upstairs in the main courtroom, Carmen Doyle's livestream had caught fire on social media. Her phone shook slightly as she narrated in hushed tones. Police vehicles continue to arrive outside the courthouse. SWAT teams are positioning themselves around the building, but sources say they're unable to enter due to Judge Hayes' lockdown order. Through the tall courthouse windows, red and blue lights flashed across worried faces. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as more emergency vehicles pulled up to the curb. Mark Grayson stood up from his corner seat, straightening his expensive tie. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he approached Leonard Price and Jana Lee, who were still arguing near the defense table. "Quite the unusual situation we have here," Grayson said smoothly, his practiced smile never reaching his eyes. "Has anyone heard what triggered this lockdown?" Price ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Complete overreach by Judge Hayes, that's what this is." "And the child?" Grayson asked casually. "The one who delivered the note? Does anyone know who she is?" Jana Lee narrowed her eyes at his pointed questions. "Why are you so interested?" Grayson's smile didn't waver. "Mere professional curiosity. We're all stuck here together, after all." In the basement, Eleanor Hayes and Detective Torres carefully locked the archive door, both aware they might have left traces of their search. The key turned with a heavy click that seemed to echo through the corridor. "Someone was looking for us down there," Torres said quietly as they started up the stairs. "Kane must have people inside the building." Eleanor Hayes nodded grimly, one hand touching the documents hidden in her pocket. Suddenly, angry shouts echoed down the stairwell from above. The words were muffled, but the tone was threatening. "Amara," Eleanor Hayes whispered, her face paling. Without another word, both women began racing up the stairs, their footsteps thundering against the metal steps as the shouting grew louder. Eleanor Hayes and Detective Torres burst through the stairwell door, their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The sound of distant shouting grew louder as they rushed toward the small corner office where they had left Amara. Eleanor's judicial robe billowed behind her as she ran, the stolen documents still safely tucked in her pocket. Through the office's glass panel, they could see Sarah Kim standing protectively in front of Amara, her body positioned between the door and the frightened child. When Sarah recognized them, she quickly unlocked the door, ushering them inside. "Thank goodness you're back," Sarah whispered, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of worry. Amara's small hand was wrapped tightly around Sarah's, her big brown eyes wide with fear but remarkably steady. Eleanor knelt down to Amara's eye level, something she'd never done in her years on the bench. "We found some of your mother's papers," she said softly, her usual stern tone replaced with gentle reassurance. "Your mother was very brave, Amara. She left behind evidence that might help us." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She just nodded, squeezing Sarah's hand tighter. A burst of angry voices from the main courtroom made them all jump. Detective Torres moved to the office door, peering through the glass. "It's Kevin Holt," she reported grimly. "The robbery defendant from courtroom 3. He's got a weapon." Sarah gasped. The security guard dropped his gun during the initial chaos of the lockdown. Holt must have grabbed it then. Through the walls, they could hear Jana Lee's voice trying to reason with Holt. "Think about what you're doing," she was saying. "This will only make things worse." "I'm not going back to prison!" Holt's voice cracked with desperation. "Someone open these doors now!" Eleanor's mind raced. As a judge, she had faced countless tense situations in her courtroom, but never anything like this. Her first instinct was to march in there herself. She had talked down angry defendants before, but one look at Amara's frightened face changed her mind. She couldn't leave this child unprotected, not after failing her mother. "I should handle this," Detective Torres said, her voice calm and professional. I've dealt with situations like this before. We need to de-escalate before someone gets hurt. Eleanor nodded slowly, reaching into her robe pocket. She carefully removed several photocopied pages from Evelyn's file and handed them to Sarah Kim. "Keep these safe," she whispered. "If anything happens, these documents need to survive." Sarah took the papers with trembling hands, quickly tucking them into her blazer's inner pocket. She wrapped her other arm around Amara's shoulders, pulling the girl closer. Detective Torres checked her weapon, then met Eleanor's eyes. "Keep them safe in here. Lock the door behind me. I'll try to talk Holt down before this gets worse." Eleanor watched as Torres stepped into the hallway, her movements deliberate and confident. As she closed the office door, Eleanor turned the lock with a decisive click. Through the glass, they watched Torres walk toward the main courtroom, her back straight and her steps measured, though Eleanor could see the tension in her shoulders. The shouts from the main courtroom grew louder, and Eleanor pulled Amara and Sarah away from the door, moving them to the far corner of the office. She positioned herself between them and the entrance, her judicial robe now serving as a shield rather than a symbol of authority. Detective Torres stepped into the main courtroom, her heart steady despite the tension crackling through the air. Kevin Holt paced near the judge's bench, his movements jerky and desperate, the stolen weapon trembling in his sweaty grip. Scattered spectators huddled beneath benches while others pressed themselves against the walls, frozen in fear. "Mr. Holt," Torres called out, her voice calm and clear. She kept her hands visible, palms up. "I'm Detective Torres. I can see you're scared right now. We all are." Holt's eyes darted between Torres and the locked courtroom doors. "Stay back! I mean it!" His voice cracked. "I'm not going back to prison. I can't." In a corner of the courtroom, Mark Grayson stood perfectly still, his expensive suit unwrinkled despite the chaos, his expression carefully blank as he observed the scene. Near him, Carmen Doyle held her phone low, continuing to livestream while trying to remain inconspicuous. "Nobody wants anyone to get hurt today," Torres continued, taking one slow step forward. "You're not a violent man, Kevin. Your record shows that. This isn't you." Meanwhile, in the quiet of the hallway outside, Eleanor Hayes knelt before Amara, her judicial robe pooling around her on the floor. The girl's small shoulders trembled as muffled shouts filtered through the walls. Sarah Kim stood nearby, watching the door with worried eyes. "I know you're frightened," Eleanor said softly, squeezing Amara's hand. All her years of maintaining strict courtroom decorum felt meaningless now, faced with this child's raw fear. "I'm scared too. But Detective Torres is very good at her job. She'll help us get through this." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes. "I miss my mom," she whispered. "She always knew what to do when things were scary." Eleanor's throat tightened with guilt and compassion. "Your mother was incredibly brave," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And so are you." Back in the courtroom, Torres had managed to edge closer to Holt. His gun hand had lowered slightly as she spoke about his family, his future, the possibilities still ahead if he made the right choice now. "We can work this out," Torres assured him, noting how his fingers had loosened on the weapon. "Just put the gun down, and—" A sudden explosive crack shattered the air. The building shuddered, and screams erupted as smoke began seeping through the ventilation system. Holt's eyes went wide with panic, his grip on the gun faltering. Torres moved with lightning speed, closing the distance between them. In one fluid motion, she knocked the weapon from his hands and pinned him against the bench. The gun skittered across the floor as fresh chaos erupted around them. Through the thickening smoke and confusion, Mark Grayson slipped quietly toward a side door. His movements were purposeful, unhurried, as if he had expected this turn of events. In the pandemonium of coughing people and frightened shouts, no one noticed his departure except Carmen Doyle, who caught his exit on her live stream. The acrid smell of smoke grew stronger as people stumbled and pushed in panic. Torres kept Holt secured, even as her eyes watered from the fumes. Whatever had caused that explosion, she knew it wasn't random. Someone had just escalated this crisis to a dangerous new level. The acrid smoke filled the corridor as alarms shrieked through the courthouse. Eleanor Hayes instinctively pulled Amara close while Sarah Kim pressed against the wall beside them. The sprinklers remained stubbornly dry despite the growing haze. "The system's been tampered with," Eleanor said, her voice tight with worry. The realization hit her hard. Kane's people were already inside, methodically destroying what they'd come to protect. Somewhere in those archives lay the truth about Evelyn's death, possibly in that one last drawer they hadn't checked. In the main courtroom, Detective Torres maintained her grip on Holt's confiscated weapon while taking charge of the situation. "Everyone stay calm and move toward the east corridor," she commanded, her steady voice cutting through the panic. "The smoke's lighter there." Jana Lee and Leonard Price, setting aside their earlier arguments, began helping people to their feet. An elderly woman stumbled, and Price caught her arm, guiding her carefully through the haze. Carmen Doyle's phone captured it all. The lawyers helping strangers, courthouse staff comforting the frightened, ordinary people becoming heroes in small but meaningful ways. "Here, let me help you," Jana Lee said to a young mother with 2 small children, leading them toward clearer air. The livestream audience watched as humanity's better nature emerged in the crisis. Once the group settled in a relatively smoke-free corridor, Eleanor Hayes pulled Detective Torres aside. "This wasn't random," Torres said in a low voice. "They're trying to stop us from finding something." Eleanor nodded, thinking of the sealed drawer they'd glimpsed earlier. "There's more down there, Maria. One more drawer we didn't get to check." A small cough drew their attention. Amara stood nearby, her eyes watery from the smoke but fixed on Eleanor with complete trust. The judge felt the weight of that trust, understanding now that saving this child meant exposing Kane's entire operation. There could be no half measures. "We need to go back down there," Eleanor said firmly. Torres checked her weapon. "We'll take the service stairs this time, less exposed." They shared a determined look, both knowing the risk had just increased exponentially. But with Amara's life hanging in the balance and Kane's operatives actively destroying evidence, they had no choice but to try. The smoke hung thick in the hallway as Eleanor Hayes and Detective Torres made their way back toward the archives. They'd torn strips from their clothing to create makeshift masks, but the acrid smell still burned their throats. Eleanor's small flashlight beam cut through the haze while Torres kept her right hand firmly on her holstered weapon. "Stay close," Torres whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows cast by flickering emergency lights. From somewhere above, they could hear frightened voices and sporadic coughing. The sounds echoed strangely in the nearly empty corridor, making it impossible to tell how many people remained trapped in the building. When they reached the archive door, Eleanor's heart sank. The lock had been destroyed, its metal housing warped and blackened. Torres knelt to examine the damage, her fingers tracing the scorched edges. "Small incendiary device," Torres muttered. "Precise. Professional." She stood and helped Eleanor force the damaged door open. Inside, chaos greeted them. Filing cabinets lay toppled like fallen dominoes. Papers carpeted the floor, some still smoking at the edges. Eleanor's throat tightened as she realized most of Evelyn's case files were gone. Years of evidence destroyed in minutes. But then she spotted it, a metal lockbox partially buried under scattered folders. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a heavy paperweight from a nearby desk. Torres positioned herself by the door, weapon ready, while Eleanor worked to pry open the box. Inside, Eleanor found what they needed: an affidavit with Victor Kane's name clearly visible, property documents linking him to suspicious cargo shipments, and a small ledger filled with coded entries. Her heart raced as she realized the significance of what they'd found. Before she could examine the documents more closely, heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor. Torres raised her hand in warning. Eleanor immediately killed the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. They pressed themselves against the cold wall, barely breathing, praying whoever approached would pass them by. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Eleanor clutched the documents to her chest, feeling her pulse pound in her ears as they waited in terrified silence. The footsteps gradually faded away, leaving Eleanor Hayes and Detective Torres in tense silence. After waiting another moment to be sure, they carefully emerged from the archives, precious documents clutched against Eleanor's chest. The smoke had grown thicker in the hallway, making their eyes water as they moved toward the maintenance area. "This way," Torres whispered, leading them through the hazy corridor. "Philip Martin might be able to help us make sense of these papers." They found the maintenance room tucked away in a quiet corner of the basement. Inside, Philip Martin stood hunched over a backup generator panel, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted wires. When the door creaked open, he startled and spun around, dropping his wrench with a clatter. "Oh, thank goodness it's you," he said, shoulders sagging with relief as he recognized Eleanor and Torres. "The power's been acting strange since that explosion." While Torres took up position near the door, Eleanor approached Philip with the coded ledger. "Mr. Martin, we need your help. Do you know anything about decoding old records, or somewhere we could examine these safely?" Philip wiped his hands on his coveralls and adjusted his glasses to study the ledger. "Actually, there's an old microfiche machine in storage room B. Nobody uses it anymore, but it still works. Might help us figure out what these codes mean." Meanwhile, upstairs in the main corridor, Mark Grayson moved carefully through clusters of frightened people. He maintained a concerned expression, occasionally offering empty words of comfort to huddled groups. His real attention focused on catching snippets of conversation, searching for any mention of Eleanor Hayes or the archives. Carmen Doyle's phone continued to broadcast shaky footage of the scene, her whispered commentary providing updates to the outside world. Through the smoke and chaos, Grayson's ears caught a crucial detail. Someone mentioned activity in the basement archives. A slight smirk crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a worried frown. As people coughed and complained about the lingering smoke, Grayson slowly backed away from the crowd. No one noticed as he slipped toward the stairwell, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble floor. His hand reached for his phone, ready to send a message about his discovery. Soon after their discussion in the maintenance room, Eleanor Hayes, Detective Torres, and Philip Martin made their way through the dim basement hallway to a cramped storage area. The small room smelled of dust and old paper, with towers of forgotten equipment casting long shadows in the weak emergency lighting. "Here it is," Philip whispered, brushing cobwebs off an ancient microfiche reader. His hands moved with practiced familiarity across the machine's controls. "Just need to power it up." Eleanor Hayes held her breath as they carefully inserted the coded ledger pages. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across their faces. Slowly, cryptic text appeared before them. "Look at this," Torres pointed, her finger tracing lines of numbers and letters. "These are addresses, all properties owned by Kane's shell companies." Eleanor Hayes' heart pounded as more details emerged. Dates, locations, and code words painted a sinister picture. "These aren't just business records," she murmured. "These are trafficking routes disguised as shipping manifests." Philip adjusted the focus, revealing more entries. "The patterns here, they match international cargo schedules. But the cargo, it's people, isn't it?" Before Eleanor could respond, a faint creak echoed from the hallway. Torres raised her hand for silence, her other hand moving to her weapon. The door handle turned slowly. "Judge Hayes?" Mark Grayson's smooth voice carried through the door. "Are you in there? We need to talk about what's happening upstairs." His words dripped with false concern. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She knew that voice, the same tone Grayson had used when defending Kane in countless cases. Torres moved into position beside the door, her expression grim. The handle rattled more forcefully. Philip tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, pointing urgently toward a rusty ventilation grate near the floor. Without a word, Torres nodded her agreement. Moving as quietly as possible, Philip loosened the grate while Eleanor gathered the crucial documents. The old metal groaned softly as they pulled it free, revealing a narrow utility tunnel beyond. Just as the door began to splinter under Grayson's assault, the three slipped into the darkness of the tunnel. Behind them, they heard the door burst open, and Grayson's frustrated curse at finding only the still-warm microfiche reader. Dust motes swirled in the dim light as Eleanor Hayes, Torres, and Philip Martin crawled through the cramped maintenance tunnel. The metal walls pressed in around them, and stale air filled their lungs. Their knees scraped against the rough surface as they moved forward, guided by the distant sound of voices from the floors above. "This should lead us to the north wing," Philip whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. Suddenly, muffled cries echoed through the ventilation system. They quickened their pace, emerging from behind a utility panel into a deserted corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the institutional green walls. A blur of movement caught their attention. Amara sprinted around the corner, her small shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Behind her, a courthouse guard moved with predatory grace, his movements too practiced, too controlled for regular security personnel. "That's not one of ours," Torres muttered, already moving forward. The fake guard reached for Amara, but Torres intercepted him with practiced efficiency. They collided in a violent tangle of limbs. The imposter was strong, but Torres matched his every move. As they grappled, Eleanor Hayes positioned herself between them and Amara. "You will not touch her," Eleanor declared, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. The girl trembled behind her, fingers gripping Eleanor's black robe. Philip Martin grabbed a nearby trash bin, using it to knock the attacker off balance. Torres seized the advantage, twisting the man's arm behind his back and forcing him to the ground. The fake guard's weapon clattered across the floor. Amara broke free from behind Eleanor and ran into her arms, sobbing quietly. Eleanor held her close, feeling the girl's tears dampen her shoulder. "It's all right now," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." Torres found a cable tie in her pocket and secured the imposter's hands while Philip kept watch. The fake guard remained silent under Torres's quick interrogation, his face set in stubborn defiance. "We need to move," Torres said, checking the corridor. "There could be more of them." They left their captive bound in an empty office, his sullen glare following them as they hurried away. Eleanor kept her arm protectively around Amara's shoulders as they moved through the hallway, searching for a secure location to regroup. The evidence they'd gathered felt heavy in her pocket, their key to bringing down Kane and ensuring Amara's safety. The smoke-tinged corridor near the main courtroom felt eerily quiet as Eleanor Hayes guided Amara toward the gathered group. Court clerk Sarah Kim rushed forward, her satchel clutched tightly against her chest. Behind an overturned wooden bench, Carmen Doyle's camera lens caught the touching scene. The usually stoic judge holding the frightened girl close, her stern facade completely transformed by genuine concern. "Thank goodness you're all safe," Sarah Kim whispered, her eyes wide with relief. The small crowd of courthouse staff and citizens huddled nearby, watching the unlikely group with a mixture of fear and hope. Detective Torres pulled Sarah Kim aside while Eleanor Hayes settled Amara onto a cushioned bench. "We found more evidence in the archives," Torres explained in hushed tones. "A coded ledger and some property records." Sarah Kim nodded, patting her satchel. "I've kept those photocopied affidavits safe. No one's touched them." Philip Martin kept watch at the corridor's end while Eleanor Hayes joined their quiet conversation. "We need to make this public," she said, her voice firm but low. "If we can present all of this evidence in the main courtroom, with everyone present—" "My live stream is still running," Carmen Doyle offered softly from behind her bench. "The whole city is watching. If you reveal Kane's crimes on air, there's no way he can cover it up." Torres glanced at the reporter's phone, then back at Eleanor Hayes. "She's right. Public pressure might force outside authorities to act, even with Kane's people inside the building." Eleanor Hayes looked at Amara, who sat quietly watching them with trust in her eyes. The judge thought of Evelyn, of her own failure to act years ago. "We'll gather everyone in the main courtroom," she decided. "Read everything we've found into the official record, broadcast it live." "It's dangerous," Torres warned, though her expression showed approval. "Kane's operatives won't just stand by." "Then we secure the area first," Eleanor Hayes replied. She and Torres exchanged determined looks, both understanding the stakes. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about justice for Evelyn and protecting her daughter. Sarah Kim clutched her satchel tighter, the evidence inside feeling more precious than ever. "I'm ready when you are, Your Honor." The small group huddled closer, finalizing details in whispers while Carmen Doyle's camera captured their unity. Outside the courthouse, thousands watched through their screens as an unprecedented alliance formed. A judge, a detective, a maintenance worker, a court clerk, and a scared little girl, all standing together against powerful forces that had stayed hidden for far too long. The smoke-tinged courtroom fell silent as Eleanor Hayes guided everyone inside. Jana Lee and Leonard Price moved efficiently through the crowd, helping people find seats. Kevin Holt, his earlier violence replaced by quiet shame, worked alongside them to arrange chairs. "Please stay calm and orderly," Jana Lee called out, her prosecutor's voice carrying authority even now. Detective Torres positioned herself near the main entrance while Philip Martin watched the side door. Sarah Kim stood ready beside the bench, clutching her satchel of evidence. Amara sat in the front row, her small frame barely visible among the adults. Eleanor Hayes ascended to her familiar position behind the bench, but everything felt different now. The affidavit and coded ledger felt heavy in her hands. She looked out at the faces before her. Courthouse staff, lawyers, citizens caught in this crisis. Carmen Doyle held her phone steady at the front, its small red light indicating the live stream continued. "What I'm about to share," Eleanor Hayes began, her voice clear and strong, "concerns the disappearance of Evelyn Thompson and the current danger to her daughter, Amara." She held up the documents. "These records prove Victor Kane's involvement in human trafficking and corruption." The crowd murmured as Eleanor Hayes detailed Evelyn's attempts to expose Kane years ago. She described the property records, the coded shipment logs, the pattern of silenced witnesses. Her usual judicial detachment gave way to passionate truth-telling. "I failed Evelyn Thompson when she came to this court for help," Eleanor Hayes admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I will not fail her daughter." Just then, footsteps echoed from the doorway. Mark Grayson appeared, his expensive suit somehow still pristine despite the chaos. 2 courthouse guards flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Grayson's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Judge Hayes," he said smoothly, stepping forward. "Spreading accusations without proof is dangerous." His gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on Carmen Doyle's camera. "Very dangerous indeed." Detective Torres's hand moved closer to her weapon. The entire courtroom held its breath, watching the confrontation unfold between the determined judge and Kane's calculating lawyer. Eleanor Hayes stood tall behind the bench, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. The affidavit trembled slightly in her hands, but her words rang clear and strong. Every face in the room turned toward her, including Carmen Doyle's camera lens, which captured this watershed moment. "On March 15th, 3 years ago," Eleanor Hayes read, "Evelyn Thompson documented multiple shipping containers arriving at Kane Industries' warehouse on Port Road." She paused, letting the words sink in. Inside these containers, she discovered evidence of human trafficking. The crowd gasped. Amara pressed closer to Sarah Kim, who wrapped a protective arm around the girl's shoulders. Detective Torres kept her steady gaze on Mark Grayson and his guards, while Philip Martin positioned himself near the evidence table. Eleanor Hayes continued reading, her voice growing stronger. "The coded ledger entries match exactly with Ms. Thompson's original testimony. Container numbers, dates, and financial transactions, all connecting directly to Victor Kane's operations." "Objection!" Mark Grayson stepped forward, his polished demeanor showing cracks. "This is clearly fabricated evidence, Your Honor. Anyone could have created these documents during today's chaos." "These papers," Eleanor Hayes held up the coded ledger, "bear official watermarks and Kane Industries' internal coding system. The same system Ms. Thompson tried to bring to my attention years ago." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jana Lee and Leonard Price exchanged knowing looks. Even Kevin Holt leaned forward, engrossed by the unfolding drama. "Furthermore," Eleanor Hayes pressed on, "these property deeds show a direct connection between Kane's shipping operations and multiple missing persons cases." Grayson's face twitched. "Your Honor, you're making dangerous assumptions without proper context." "The context," Eleanor Hayes cut him off, "is right here in your client's own handwriting." She held up another document. "Mr. Kane's signature appears on every transaction involving these properties." The courthouse guards flanking Grayson shifted uncomfortably. One of them took a small step back. Carmen Doyle's live stream captured every moment as Grayson's confident facade began to crumble. "This is..." Grayson's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "This is completely circumstantial. You can't possibly..." "I can and I will," Eleanor Hayes declared, her eyes meeting his. "Every detail in this affidavit correlates perfectly with the evidence Ms. Thompson tried to present 3 years ago." The crowd's whispers grew louder. Through Carmen Doyle's camera, thousands of viewers watched as the truth finally emerged, witnessed by a room full of citizens and carried live across the city. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Kevin Holt rose shakily to his feet. His earlier desperate actions forgotten, he cleared his throat and spoke with unexpected clarity. "Your Honor, before everything happened today, I saw men I didn't recognize down in the basement level. They weren't courthouse staff. They were checking doors, looking around corners like they were searching for something." Eleanor Hayes leaned forward, her stern facade now replaced with keen interest. "Can you describe what you saw, Mr. Holt?" "They had badges, but they moved wrong, not like real security. And right before the explosion, I saw them carrying something in dark duffel bags." Jana Lee stood up next, her prosecutor's instincts engaged. "Your Honor, this lockdown and the targeted destruction, it's too coordinated to be random. Someone knew we might find evidence here." Leonard Price nodded in agreement. "The timing of the explosion, the missing files, it all points to a deliberate attempt to prevent these revelations." Outside the courthouse, the scene had transformed. Police vehicles and SWAT teams formed a tight perimeter around the building. On their phones and tablets, officers watched Carmen Doyle's live stream, now being broadcast by major news networks. The crowd of onlookers had swelled, their voices rising in support of the young girl and the judge who dared to stand up to corruption. Inside, Mark Grayson's polished demeanor cracked further. His eyes darted between the exits, calculating. With a subtle nod to the guards beside him, he took a small step backward. The 2 guards moved suddenly, drawing weapons from beneath their uniforms. Detective Torres reacted instantly, positioning herself between the armed men and Eleanor Hayes. Philip Martin lunged forward, shielding Amara and Sarah Kim with his body. Gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. Carmen Doyle's camera captured everything as people ducked behind benches. The weapons gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a final desperate attempt to silence the truth. Eleanor Hayes stood firm behind her bench, the evidence still clutched in her hands. She met Grayson's gaze, understanding flowing between them. This was Kane's last resort, a violent end to years of secrets. "Drop your weapons," Torres commanded, her own gun steady in her hands. "The whole world is watching." Detective Torres stood her ground, her stance unwavering as she faced the armed guards. Her voice carried across the now silent courtroom. "Drop your weapons. Now." The first guard's hand trembled slightly, his grip on the gun loosening. Uncertainty flickered across his face as he glanced at his partner. The second guard, however, kept his weapon trained steadily, his lips curled into a snarl. "Everyone stay where you are," the second guard growled. Behind the bench, Eleanor Hayes wrapped her arms protectively around Amara, shielding the child with her body. The girl pressed close, her small hands gripping Eleanor's robe. Philip Martin inched toward a heavy wooden chair, his movements careful and deliberate. Sarah Kim held the precious documents against her chest, her knuckles white. Carmen Doyle's camera captured every moment from behind a marble column. The live stream continued broadcasting to thousands of viewers as people throughout the courtroom scrambled for cover. Spectators pressed themselves against walls and ducked behind wooden pews, their frightened breaths echoing in the tense space. Mark Grayson stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. His polished facade cracked further as he spoke. "Judge Hayes, let's be sensible about this. There's still a way everyone walks out of here safely." He straightened his tie, attempting to project control. "Just hand over those documents, agree to forget what you've seen, and Mr. Kane will ensure no one gets hurt." Eleanor Hayes stood tall behind her bench, her voice steady and clear. "We're done playing by your rules." Her words rang through the courtroom, captured perfectly by Carmen's live stream. The woman who had once hidden behind strict procedure and cold detachment was gone. In her place stood someone who had rediscovered her moral compass, someone who refused to look away from injustice again. The transformation was visible to everyone watching, both in the courtroom and through their screens. This was no longer the judge who had dismissed Evelyn's pleas years ago. This was a woman who had chosen to stand against corruption no matter the cost. Outside the courthouse, SWAT team leaders huddled around surveillance equipment, watching Carmen Doyle's livestream with growing concern. The feed showed armed men threatening civilians inside the courtroom. Captain Rodriguez shook his head. "We can't wait any longer, the public's demanding action." Inside, the tension crackled as a booming voice echoed through the building. "This is SWAT. We are entering in 30 seconds. All armed individuals, lay down your weapons." Mark Grayson's composed facade crumbled. His face went ash-white as he realized his options were vanishing. Detective Torres seized the moment, her voice sharp and commanding. "Drop your weapons. This ends now." The first guard looked at his partner, then at the doors that would soon burst open. Making his choice, he slowly lowered his gun to the floor and stepped back, hands raised. The second guard's finger trembled on the trigger, his resolve weakening but not yet broken. Kevin Holt, the defendant who had caused earlier chaos, saw a chance for redemption. Without warning, he grabbed a heavy wooden chair and charged at the remaining armed guard. The unexpected move caught the guard off balance. As he stumbled, Detective Torres moved with practiced efficiency, disarming him in one fluid motion. Grayson spun toward the exit but found his escape blocked. Jana Lee and Leonard Price stood firmly in the doorway, their earlier professional rivalries forgotten as they united against a greater threat. Trapped, Grayson's shoulders slumped in defeat. Eleanor Hayes stepped down from behind the bench, still holding the damning affidavit. Her voice carried across the courtroom with renewed authority. "Victor Kane's network ends here. You will not silence Evelyn's voice, and you will not harm Amara." Carmen Doyle's camera captured every word as heavy thuds began to sound from the main entrance. The SWAT team was about to breach. The heavy courthouse doors burst open with a thunderous crash. SWAT teams flooded in, their black tactical gear a stark contrast to the ornate marble halls. Their movements were precise and coordinated, weapons raised as they swept through the building, following the intelligence gathered from Carmen Doyle's livestream. Mark Grayson's composure completely dissolved. He tried to shuffle backward into the crowd, hunching his shoulders and lowering his head. But Detective Torres's voice rang out clear and firm. "That's Kane's man. Arrest him." She pointed directly at Grayson, and SWAT officers converged on him immediately. As they secured handcuffs around his wrists, Grayson's expensive suit wrinkled, and his carefully styled hair fell across his forehead. The man who had wielded threats and intimidation just moments ago now looked small and afraid. Carmen Doyle's camera captured the scene, panning across the courtroom. The transformation was remarkable. People who had been huddled in terror now stood straight, relief evident on their faces. Jana Lee and Leonard Price, setting aside their usual adversarial roles, worked together to help elderly spectators find comfortable seats. They guided those with minor injuries toward the arriving paramedics. Sarah Kim caught Philip Martin's eye from across the room. They shared a quiet smile, acknowledging the part they had played in this moment of justice. The maintenance worker gave a small nod, his earlier nervousness replaced with quiet pride. Outside the courthouse, police vehicles created a tight perimeter. Officers were already coordinating with other precincts, launching an immediate search for Victor Kane. The hunt for the true architect of this corruption was beginning. Inside the now secure courtroom, Eleanor Hayes stepped down from her position behind the bench. Her judicial robe swept the floor as she knelt beside Amara. The young girl's eyes were wet with tears, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. Hope had replaced terror in her gaze. "It's over," Eleanor Hayes whispered, her voice gentle and warm, nothing like the stern tone she had used in court just hours ago. She held the affidavit and ledger pages carefully, the evidence that would ensure justice would finally follow its proper course. On thousands of screens across the city, viewers watched and cheered. The courthouse, once a symbol of cold procedure, had become something else entirely, a beacon of truth where courage and justice had prevailed. the courthouse halls filled with the steady flow of paramedics and additional police officers. Their efficient movements brought order to the chaos as they tended to minor injuries and guided shaken survivors toward the exits. Eleanor Hayes stood near the judge's bench, carefully handling the affidavit and ledger pages that would bring down Victor Kane's empire. A senior detective, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, approached with purposeful steps. Eleanor Hayes handed him the documents with precise movements, ensuring proper procedure. "These contain evidence of trafficking operations and financial crimes," she explained, her voice steady. "They're connected to Victor Kane and the death of Evelyn Martinez." In a quiet corner of the courtroom, away from the bustle of first responders, Detective Torres and Eleanor Hayes found a moment to talk. "Without your live-stream decision and courage to stand up to them, Kane's network might have stayed hidden forever," Torres said softly, respect evident in her tone. Eleanor Hayes shook her head. "And without your bravery in that standoff, we might not be here." They shared a knowing look, both understanding how the day's events had changed them, strengthened their commitment to justice. Near the courthouse steps, Carmen Doyle faced her phone camera one last time. Her voice carried the weight of the moment as she addressed the thousands still watching. "Today we witnessed ordinary people become heroes," she reported. "A court clerk who protected crucial documents at risk to herself. A defendant who chose redemption by helping stop armed men. And most remarkably, a judge known for her strict demeanor, who became a fierce protector of truth and justice when a child asked for help." The setting sun cast long shadows as emergency lights painted the courthouse exterior in alternating red and blue. Inside, people breathed easier, their shoulders lighter. The air itself seemed clearer, as if the truth had cleaned away years of accumulated silence and fear. The night air carried a gentle breeze as Eleanor Hayes sat in a folding chair outside the makeshift police command post. The stars twinkled overhead, their peaceful presence a stark contrast to the day's turmoil. Detective Maria Torres approached, holding 2 paper cups of coffee that had long since lost their warmth. "It's not exactly gourmet," Torres said, handing one to Eleanor Hayes. Around them, police officers methodically packed up equipment into vans while paramedics finished checking the last few courthouse survivors. The red and blue emergency lights still pulsed quietly against the building's stone facade. A senior detective approached Eleanor Hayes with purposeful steps. "Judge Hayes, we've got units pursuing Kane already," he reported. "With the ledger and those affidavits, we have more than enough for an arrest warrant. He won't slip away this time." On nearby news vans, screens displayed breaking coverage. Reporters spoke solemnly about Evelyn Martinez, no longer describing her as delusional or unstable as they had years before. Instead, they praised her foresight and sacrifice, acknowledging the truth she had tried to expose. Sarah Kim and Philip Martin stood nearby, their faces showing exhaustion but relief. Amara hadn't left Eleanor Hayes' side, her small frame pressed close to the judge's chair. The child's eyes were heavy with fatigue, but she seemed at peace for the first time since entering the courthouse. "All the evidence has been properly logged and secured," Torres announced, checking her phone. "Multiple copies are already with different agencies." Carmen Doyle approached their small group. Her live stream finally ended after hours of continuous coverage. Tears glistened in her eyes as she faced Eleanor Hayes. "Judge Hayes," she said, voice thick with emotion. "What you did today, standing up to them like that, thank you." Eleanor Hayes looked down at her coffee cup, her voice quiet but firm. "I failed Evelyn when she came to me. I was too rigid, too focused on procedure instead of truth. Today, I finally did what I should have done back then." The morning sun crept through Eleanor Hayes' kitchen window, casting long shadows across her worn oak table. She had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, her mind replaying the previous day's events like a vivid movie. The television hummed softly in the background, where news anchors dissected every moment of the courthouse drama. In an unprecedented display of courage, Judge Eleanor Hayes stood against corruption. A reporter's voice drifted from the screen. Images flashed showing her reading the affidavit, Detective Torres protecting Amara, and the tense standoff that had captivated viewers across the nation. Eleanor Hayes barely touched her coffee as she spread old newspaper clippings across the table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she found the yellowed article about Evelyn's case from years ago. The headline seemed to mock her now. Judge dismisses whistleblower claims against prominent businessman. She remembered Evelyn's desperate eyes, the way her voice had cracked while pleading for someone to listen. "I was wrong," Eleanor Hayes whispered to the empty kitchen. "So terribly wrong." With determined movements, she picked up her phone and dialed the district attorney's office. After the beep, her voice came out clear and steady. "This is Judge Eleanor Hayes. I'm formally requesting the reopening of Evelyn Martinez's whistleblower case against Victor Kane. New evidence supports her original claims. Her truth deserves to be acknowledged and honored. Please call me back to discuss the details." The afternoon brought gray clouds and a slight chill as Eleanor Hayes walked into the police station. Detective Torres waited in a small conference room, case files spread before her. Maps marked with possible Kane locations covered one wall. "We've got teams following solid leads," Torres said, gesturing to the maps. "Kane's network is crumbling. His associates are already turning on each other, hoping for deals." Eleanor Hayes nodded, sinking into a chair. "Good. He can't hide forever." "The evidence we found..." Torres paused, studying Eleanor Hayes's face. "It's already changing things. People are coming forward with more information. They're not afraid anymore." Silence settled between them as both women considered how much had changed in 24 hours. The courthouse lockdown had transformed them from casual acquaintances into something deeper, companions who had faced danger together, who had chosen truth over safety. "I heard rumors," Torres said carefully, "about you considering stepping down from the bench." Eleanor Hayes didn't respond immediately. She ran her fingers along the edge of the conference table, thinking about the black robe hanging in her chambers. That robe had once felt like armor, a symbol of order and control. Now it felt more like a constraint. "The bench isn't where I need to be anymore," Eleanor Hayes finally admitted. "There are other ways to serve justice." Torres nodded, understanding, reflecting in her eyes. They sat together in companionable quiet, watching through the conference room window as officers hurried past, all part of the massive effort to bring Victor Kane to justice. The Community Resource Center buzzed with quiet energy as morning light streamed through its newly installed windows. The building, once a neglected municipal structure, now stood as a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. Eleanor Hayes moved through the front office, her practical blazer and slacks a stark contrast to the judicial robes she'd worn for so many years. She paused at the reception desk, sorting through colorful pamphlets designed to help those most in need. "Legal Aid for Trafficking Survivors," read one cover. "Know Your Rights, Immigration Guide," declared another. Each represented a piece of the work she'd chosen instead of the bench, the real human side of justice she'd overlooked for too long. "Quite a change from court orders and case files," Detective Maria Torres said, appearing in the doorway with 2 coffee cups. She handed one to Eleanor Hayes, who accepted it with a grateful smile. "A good change," Eleanor Hayes replied, gesturing for Torres to join her at a small consultation table. "How did it go last night?" Torres's eyes lit up. Kane never made it off the runway. His private pilot actually called in the tip. Seems even his most loyal employees couldn't stomach what he'd done once the truth came out. She pulled out her phone, showing Eleanor Hayes the morning news headlines. "Corrupt tycoon Kane arrested. Trafficking network exposed." "Evelyn would be proud," Eleanor Hayes said softly, touching the screen where another headline credited whistleblower evidence for the breakthrough. Her documentation laid the groundwork. All those careful notes she kept, and her daughter's courage to bring it all to light, Torres added. "Speaking of which, how is Amara settling in?" Eleanor Hayes led Torres down a freshly painted hallway, its walls adorned with vibrant murals celebrating community leaders and activists. Children's artwork decorated bulletin boards between the portraits, bringing warmth to the space. "See for yourself," Eleanor Hayes said, stopping at the entrance to a cozy reading room. Inside, Amara sat at a round table with Sarah Kim, who had taken to visiting the center during her lunch breaks. The girl's face was bent over a book, her fingers tracing the words as she read. She looked different now, more relaxed, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight of fear. Her new foster parents should be here soon, Eleanor Hayes explained quietly to Torres. They're experienced with trauma cases, and they live in a lovely neighborhood with a great school nearby. As if sensing their presence, Amara looked up. Her face brightened at the sight of Eleanor Hayes, and she offered a small wave. The gesture, though simple, carried such trust and affection that Eleanor Hayes felt her heart swell. Sarah Kim smiled too, closing her own book to acknowledge their visitors. Sunlight poured through the reading room's tall windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. It caught the edges of book spines on nearby shelves and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an almost magical atmosphere. In this light, surrounded by books and hope instead of gavels and strict procedure, Eleanor Hayes felt the rightness of her decision to leave the bench. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the small courthouse, casting gentle shadows across the polished wooden benches. Eleanor Hayes sat quietly in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, watching as prosecutors presented the evidence that had cost Evelyn her life. The courtroom felt different from this perspective. More intimate, more human. The lead prosecutor, a woman with silver-streaked hair, held up the authenticated documents that had been recovered during the lockdown. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "These records prove beyond doubt that Evelyn Martinez acted as a whistleblower, attempting to expose Victor Kane's criminal enterprise at great personal risk." The judge, an older man with kind eyes, studied the papers carefully. His gaze moved deliberately across each page, taking in the details that Evelyn had so meticulously documented. Eleanor Hayes found herself holding her breath, remembering how she had once dismissed these same claims from her own bench. "The court recognizes Evelyn Martinez's role as a key whistleblower in the Kane investigation," the judge announced, his words echoing through the hushed chamber. "Let the record reflect that her initial reports were substantiated, and her actions demonstrated remarkable courage in the face of systemic corruption." Eleanor Hayes felt tears prick at her eyes. Though Evelyn couldn't be there to hear these words, her truth had finally been acknowledged. The official recognition felt like a weight lifting, a wrong being set right. Outside on the courthouse steps, the spring air carried the scent of blooming cherry trees. Carmen Doyle stood with her camera crew, interviewing local residents about the hearing's significance. A young law student spoke passionately about accountability, while a community organizer praised the power of persistence in seeking justice. When Carmen spotted Eleanor Hayes emerging from the building, she gave an enthusiastic thumbs up without interrupting her current interview. The gesture spoke volumes about how public perception had shifted. The same media that once portrayed Eleanor Hayes as an unyielding figure of authority now celebrated her as someone who had chosen truth over tradition, humanity over hierarchy. That evening, Eleanor Hayes met with Marisol and Daniel Johnson in a warm, welcoming conference room at the community center. The Johnsons sat close together on a comfortable sofa, their body language open and gentle. Marisol, a kindergarten teacher with laugh lines around her eyes, spoke softly about their experience fostering traumatized children. Daniel, who ran a youth mentoring program, described their home and the room they had prepared for Amara. Amara stood next to Eleanor Hayes, her small hand clutching the edge of Eleanor's jacket. Though she had met the Johnsons several times during the careful vetting process, this moment felt weightier, more final. Eleanor Hayes knelt down beside Amara, meeting her eyes directly. "Remember what we talked about?" she asked gently. "This isn't goodbye, it's just a new chapter." "You'll still visit?" Amara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course I will," Eleanor Hayes assured her, squeezing her hand. "And you can call me anytime. The Johnsons have all my numbers." Marisol stepped forward, her expression full of understanding. "We know how special Amara is," she said to Eleanor Hayes. "Thank you for protecting her when she needed it most. We promise to give her all the love and support she deserves." Daniel nodded earnestly. "Our home is always open to you, Judge Hayes. Or should I say Ms. Hayes now?" he added with a warm smile. "Eleanor is fine," she replied, standing up but keeping hold of Amara's hand. "We're all family now, in our own way." The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the willow tree's swaying branches as Eleanor Hayes stood quietly by the small lake. The park buzzed with gentle activity, children laughing on swings, dogs chasing tennis balls, elderly couples strolling hand in hand. This peaceful scene felt worlds away from the tense courthouse corridors where everything had changed just weeks ago. Eleanor Hayes smoothed her casual blazer, no longer weighed down by judicial robes. Her eyes scanned the winding path until she spotted them, Marisol and Daniel Johnson walking beside Amara, whose pink backpack bounced slightly with each step. The foster parents waved warmly when they saw Eleanor Hayes, then stepped back to give the two some privacy. "Hi," Amara said softly, clutching a silver picture frame to her chest. "Hi there," Eleanor Hayes replied, her voice gentle. "Would you like to walk with me?" They fell into step together along the lakeside path. Ducks paddled nearby, creating gentle ripples in the water. Eleanor Hayes noticed how Amara's shoulders seemed more relaxed now, her steps lighter than during those frightening days in the courthouse. "Mom used to bring me here," Amara said, looking down at the framed photograph. In it, Evelyn smiled broadly, her arms wrapped around a younger Amara. "We'd feed the ducks and make up stories about where they flew to at night." Eleanor Hayes felt her throat tighten. "Your mother was very brave, Amara. She tried to help people even when it was scary." "Like you did," Amara said, glancing up at Eleanor Hayes. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, passing beneath flowering dogwood trees. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and spring blossoms. "I'm not going to be a judge anymore," Eleanor Hayes explained, her voice steady. "But I'm still going to help people, especially kids who need someone to listen to them and believe them. Like your mother tried to do, like I should have done back then." Amara stopped walking and turned to face Eleanor Hayes. "But you did listen. When it really mattered, you listened." The setting sun painted the lake's surface in shimmers of gold and orange. From their spot on the path, Eleanor Hayes could see Marisol and Daniel sitting on a distant bench, giving occasional encouraging waves but respecting the private moment. Eleanor Hayes led Amara to a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water. As they sat down, Amara carefully placed the photograph between them. "You kept your promise," she said simply, her voice warm and genuine. Eleanor Hayes felt tears welling up but didn't try to hide them. These weren't tears of regret or guilt anymore, but of something softer, healing, perhaps, or hope. The lake rippled peacefully before them, and somewhere overhead a bird called out to its mate. They sat together in understanding silence, watching the sun's golden light dance across the water. In this quiet moment, both found something they needed. Amara, the security of a promise kept. Eleanor Hayes, the grace of redemption through action rather than authority. The evening air grew cool and sweet around them as they shared this peaceful interval. Two souls connected by loss but sustained by truth. Weeks melted into months as Eleanor Hayes embraced her new path. The Community Resource Center became her second home, its walls now adorned with colorful posters offering help in multiple languages. She spent her mornings reviewing cases of families caught in legal tangles, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she searched for solutions that courts might have missed. Detective Maria Torres often joined her for coffee in the center's small break room. Together, they developed programs to identify trafficking risks and protect vulnerable youth. Their partnership, forged in crisis, had evolved into a powerful force for change. Torres would bring case files, and Eleanor Hayes would provide insights from her years on the bench, now filtered through a lens of compassion rather than strict interpretation. Carmen Doyle's latest television segment captured Eleanor Hayes in action, kneeling beside a frightened immigrant mother, explaining her rights in simple terms. "From the judge's bench to the community trenches," Carmen's voiceover declared. "Eleanor Hayes reminds us that integrity can bloom even in our darkest hours." The story went viral, touching hearts across the city. During the winter holidays, a card arrived at Eleanor Hayes' office. Inside, Philip Martin's neat handwriting expressed gratitude. "You showed me that one person's courage can change everything. Thank you for helping me believe in justice again." She displayed it proudly beside her degrees, valuing it more than her judicial commendations. Sarah Kim, now supervising court clerks herself, maintained regular contact. Over lunch meetings, she shared stories of training new staff, always emphasizing the importance of seeing the human beings behind the case numbers. "That day changed everything," she would say, referring to the courthouse lockdown. "Now I teach my clerks that compassion isn't opposed to justice. It's essential to it." The city's attitude toward Eleanor Hayes shifted dramatically. Where once they saw an intimidating figure in black robes, they now recognized a champion of the vulnerable. Community leaders sought her advice, and former critics admitted they had misjudged her. Even her old courthouse colleagues, initially skeptical of her transformation, came to respect her new role. On a mild afternoon, Eleanor Hayes sat on her favorite bench in the park, watching ducks glide across the lake's surface. The same bench where she and Amara had shared so many meaningful conversations now served as a reminder of how far they'd both come. A familiar bell chimed in the distance, and Eleanor Hayes looked up to see Amara pedaling confidently on her blue bicycle, her hair streaming behind her like a victory flag. Marisol and Daniel Johnson jogged alongside, their faces glowing with parental pride. Amara had grown taller, more assured. Gone was the frightened child who had slipped into a courtroom with a desperate note. In her place wrote a young girl whose smile could light up the darkest day. The Johnsons had proven to be everything Eleanor Hayes had hoped for: patient, loving, and dedicated to helping Amara heal while honoring Evelyn's memory. Eleanor Hayes stood and waved, her heart full as she watched them approach. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm, golden light, as if nature itself approved of this moment. The park's peaceful atmosphere embraced them all, a stark contrast to the tension-filled days that had brought them together. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Eleanor and Amara, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.